It caused an explosion in the shuttle, and there is very little chance that anyone could have survived that blast.
Bruce, this happened, we're told, 1 minute and 12 seconds into the launch. What would have been happening at that precise moment?
Well, the first crucial thing that happens is at 2 minutes and 7 seconds into the launch is when the solid rocket boosters, the two large fuel tank-looking devices that are on the side of the shuttle.
Excuse me, Bruce, just 1 second. Bruce, let me, for 1 second, if we have a model here in our studios in New York. This is Dan Rather, CBS News in New York, with a special report about what apparently is an explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, 1 minute and 12 seconds into the launch. Bruce Hall, our veteran CBS News correspondent, is in Florida. Bruce, I wanted to interrupt for just 1 second for those who are unfamiliar or have perhaps need a slight review, the way the space shuttle goes up. This is the space shuttle itself. This is a model. These are the solid rocket boosters that Bruce is talking about. This is what we might call the main fuel tank. Check me as we go along here, Bruce. The one that is the main fuel tank that carries the shuttle riding piggyback aboard it. But these are the solid rocket boosters that actually are responsible for the early stages of the launch. Now, that being our little model and putting people somewhat in the picture, Bruce, if you'd continue as to what may have happened 1 minute and 12 seconds into launch when the space shuttle apparently exploded this morning.
Dan, it appeared that two things happened to us as we were watching. First, as it left the shuttle pad, it appeared to be one of the slowest liftoffs that any of us have seen. However, this is a different launch pad than they have used before. But as you said, at 1 minute and 12 into the flight, the solid rocket boosters, the two white tanks that you just showed us, normally just fall away at 2:07 into the flight. However, at about 1:12 into this, they went a different direction. They did not fall away, and within just a matter of 2, 3, maybe 5 seconds later, there was a major explosion which appeared to be the shuttle itself and the main tank, which is still attached to the shuttle and would remain attached to the shuttle until it gets over the Indian Ocean. That normally drops over the Indian Ocean, and the shuttle goes on into orbit from there.
Bruce, we want to replay the videotape of the launch this morning, and perhaps you could help me as we go along and describe what is happening. We also want to listen to mission control.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Everything is normal there, Dan. You can see a very good shot. There it is. That is the explosion.
15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second.
And there is the second explosion. As you see, they appear to go off in two separate directions. But it is that first main explosion. And we see here, in reality, I think that is a large piece of debris, the remains, getting ready just to float into the ocean. But it is that first explosion, which it appeared to be in the solid rocket boosters, but we're going to have to wait for official confirmation from NASA on that. NASA has still indicated that they are looking at the situation, trying to figure out exactly what happened.
Bruce, we're told that Mission Control now says that parts of the spacecraft fell at 28.64 north latitude and 80.28 degrees west longitude. That would be just a few miles off of Cape Canaveral, and what are described as rescue vessels and personnel have been dispatched to that scene. Now, I want to again use our little model here, if we may, that what Bruce Hall was saying, nobody knows what happened aboard the space shuttle this morning when it exploded 1 minute and 12 seconds after launch. But what Bruce has raised, what we do know is the space shuttle having been launched, the component parts of it, the space shuttle itself piggybacking on this huge fuel tank, but lifted into orbit by the solid rocket boosters on the side. Now, given where the space shuttle was, and given the circumstances of the explosion, Bruce pointed out that one of the hypotheses being put forward is that the explosion originated in these solid rocket boosters. Now, Bruce, what do we know about the solid rocket boosters, and how soon would they have dropped away if all had gone? Before you do that, Bruce, Larry Speaks is now briefing at the White House, and we go directly to the White House for the Speaks briefing.
Adjoining room, the president's study, where there's a television, and the president then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the president is concerned. He is saddened. He is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information as to the condition of the crew, Larry, at this point?
We don't have any more information than what is being provided to the public on television. Hopefully later we will be able to get some, and that's the president's first priority is to find out what information that is available. We just don't have any more. No, we have not from the Oval Office.
Will this affect in any way the plans for the State of the Union tonight?
I don't believe so. I'm certain that the president will feel compelled to mention this, depending on the outcome of what we learn here in a few minutes.
Will it affect the shuttle program?
Well, that's hard to say, you know, here in 15 or 20 minutes after an incident of this type is concerned. I'm sure it will not affect the United States' determination to consider to continue the exploration of space and all the benefits we've received from it.
Can you tell us anything else about the schedule?
While this is indeed tragic, it certainly will not deter the United States in its interest in space exploration.
All the problems that the shuttle has had, will any substantial reevaluation be done of the program itself?
Well, once again, you're very premature in asking a question concerning the future of the space program. The United States has met adversity many times before in the space program. It is one of the most effective and successful programs of that type that any country has ever undertaken.
Larry, can you tell us anything specifically that the president said, any quotations, and did he make any mention of the fact that the teacher that he suggested, that the program of a teacher in space, that teacher was on board this flight?
Well, I know that was on his mind. Quite frankly, the president stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this is very, very early, and there's just nothing we can say. Our immediate concern is the crew, and all of these other questions will just have to be deferred until much later.
Was anything said about the fact that the teacher was on board this plane?
Well, it was something that was on all of our minds, that we did have the first teacher in space, really the first civilian, so to speak, other than our members of Congress who have flown in space, and certainly that's on our mind.
Are there any scientific aides who have been able to say that they could survive such an explosion as witnessed?
Just don't have that kind of information
You
yet.
said that the Vice President, Admiral Poindexter, informed the President. How did the White House learn about it?
I'm certain that we probably learned it from the news media, as we do many times when incidents like this occur unexpectedly.
Might this influence the decision about whether other civilians will be allowed on the shuttle from now on, Larry?
Once again, all of these questions, our immediate concern is for the fate of the crew, to find out exactly what has happened to those 7 people aboard. All of these other questions will just have to wait till later. Dave?
Tell us anything about what the president's schedule, how the president's schedule is changing now?
The president's schedule has not changed. He will keep on with what he had planned today and the State of the Union tonight. And once again, I think the only change in his schedule would be to simply be updated and try to seek the facts in this.
Will the president be making a phone call to the family, Larry?
I just don't know. He customarily does, but we're going to wait till we find out what the facts are.
Larry, he watched in silence, but were there no quotes that you could give us?
Nothing. It was virtually in silence.
Are you going to know what's being done now, Larry, in terms of searching for?
No. All of that information we just do not have yet. Dale, you had one question and you want to go? Okay.
What are your plans? What are your plans about briefing the rest of the afternoon on this?
Well, I think once we find out what the facts are and particularly what the fate of the crew is, then we'll be prepared to say something.
Larry, did you detect any sign of emotion as the president watched? Was he shaking his head? Was his eyes moist?
Concern, anxiety, silence.
Reagan spokesman live from the White House. For those of you who may just now be joining us, this is a CBS News special report. Dan Rather, CBS News in New York, with Bruce Hall, our veteran space correspondent at Cape Canaveral in Florida. Space Shuttle Challenger apparently exploded into a gigantic fireball moments after liftoff today, about a minute and 12 seconds after liftoff. Apparently, and we say apparently because no one can know for sure, all 7 crew members, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, may have been killed. There was no announcement of the fate of the crew, but it appeared that there was no way they could survive. Now, what I'm quoting from here is the Associated Press story out of Cape Canaveral, and it says, and I quote, "There was no announcement on the fate of the crew, but it appeared there was no way they could survive." Now, let's go to Cape Canaveral now. Among other things, we want to play for you, again, the videotape of this morning's liftoff and launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger and what was seen. The space lift went up, and this is what Mission Control was saying.
Go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
This is videotape of...
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
This is a still photograph of the crew members. Commander Francis Scobie, Michael J. Smith, the pilot, Judith Resnick, astronaut, Ronald McNair, Ellison Oezuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, the schoolteacher from Concord, New Hampshire. The schoolteacher McAuliffe, Krista McAuliffe, was the first person to be put aboard a space shuttle who was not connected in some way with the United States government. And we want to show that still picture again because she is the second from the left on the top row, schoolteacher McAuliffe. Now, I want to emphasize, we must keep doing this, that no one knows what happened aboard that space shuttle this morning, and no one knows whether there are any survivors. You may say, well, after seeing that tremendous fireball, how could there possibly be survivors? And I simply don't have an answer for that. NASA is saying, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is saying nothing, but those who have covered these space launches over the many, many years say that while there's been no announcement on the fate of the crew, it appeared, that may prove to be the operative word, it appeared there was no way they could survive. Now, let me bring you up to date as best we can on where we stand in this story. The Space Shuttle Challenger, after all these delays, and there have been so many over the last few months and weeks, and with this particular Space Shuttle Challenger flight, there were the delays. It went off this morning on liftoff in freezing cold weather in Florida, unusually cold weather for Florida even for this time of year. As you heard Bruce Hall say at the Cape, even from the first moments of liftoff, veteran observers there thought the liftoff was unusually slow, was the way Bruce Hall put it. The $1.2 billion spacecraft appeared to be destroyed 1 minute and 12 seconds into the launch. This was the first in-the-air disaster in 56 U.S. man-in-space missions. Although there were those of you who were following the space program at the time may recall that 3 astronauts were killed in 1967 on a launch pad explosion during the Apollo program. That was in the program that eventually took America to the moon. But you will note that in 1967, when the 3 astronauts were killed, they were killed on the pad while waiting to be launched. This morning's explosion, as you saw, happened 1 minute and 12 seconds about into the launch. After a series of weather and technical delays, the shuttle rose spectacularly off the launch pad this morning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It seemed to be climbing smoothly, trailing behind it that great blast of fire, that geyser of fire, which suddenly it erupted into a huge fireball, and the whole space shuttle apparatus shot out of control. A voice at Mission Control in Houston, perhaps you heard it on the videotape, said, "We are checking with recovery forces to see what can be done at this point." This is a replay of the videotape.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
That awful play it would never happen scene of the space shuttle exploding in air. Now, on the crucial matter of ejection seats, there are none on board Space Shuttle Challenger. There was no way in practice to make 7 ejection seats work on a shuttle. And in theory, it was thought that no one could survive an ejection from the shuttle. So in any case, we're told that there were no ejection seats on the space shuttle. Now, earlier, I said to you, and I want to explain for clarification, that there are a number of safety procedures aboard the shuttle. There are a number of procedures designed for escape from the shuttle, particularly when it's still on the launch pad. But we now know, we've sought out information and have confirmed that there were no ejection seats aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Now, the explosion was a devastating setback to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration after successfully carrying out 24 space shuttle missions in less than 5 years. There have been 56 U.S. manned space missions. That includes the whole first go into space, the moon program, the Apollo program, and the space shuttle program. But in the space shuttle program itself, there have been 24 space shuttle missions in slightly less than 5 years, increasing difficulty with these space shuttle missions in recent weeks and months. There were 7 crew members aboard. That included the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old New Hampshire school teacher who was selected as America's first citizen in space. That is, citizen not directly connected with the government. You recall that one senator and one member of the House of Representatives had been fired into space, but never a completely unconnected, if you will, civilian had attempted to be a space passenger before. Mission Control in Houston said debris from the shuttle fell several miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. Recovery forces, as we mentioned, were speeding in that direction, and we showed in the early portion of our CBS News Live report a parachute coming down in the area, and we were told later that was a paramedic who was being parachuted into the sea very near Cape Canaveral to find what that paramedic could among the debris that was beginning to fall. Now, the other crew members aboard the space shuttle, besides the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, were Commander Francis Scobie, he's 46, the pilot, Michael J. Smith, who's 40, Judith Resnick, who's 36 years old, Ronald E. McNair, who's 35, and Ellison S. Onosuka, who's 39, along with Gregory B. Jarvis, who is 41 years old. All of those, except school teacher McAuliffe, part of the crew. She is second from the left in this photograph. Check me if you will, Terry. On the second from the left in this photograph is the school teacher, McAuliffe. Mission Control has confirmed that parts of the spacecraft fell at 28.64 north latitude, 80.28 degrees west longitude. That's just a few miles off of Cape Canaveral. Ships and helicopters are right now racing to that area. Mission Control Center in Houston said that paramedics, and now they say plural, paramedics had leaped into the water. We had only seen one before. Again, to repeat for emphasis, the space shot took place in Florida, but as the control of the shot, as has been the case for so many years, is Mission Control in Houston. Now, they were twisting contrails of the explosion, lingering in the clear morning sky, but Challenger apparently fell into the sea due east of the Kennedy Space Center, and that's where the ships and helicopters are now proceeding to check out that area. Tracking reported that the vehicle had exploded and impacted the water in an area located just east of Cape Canaveral. Recovery forces include a C-130 aircraft. That's a huge transport plane which soon should be circling the area where the debris, what's left of this morning's Space Shuttle Challenger, apparently has come down into the water. While this was the 25th shuttle flight and the 10th flight for this particular space shuttle, the Challenger, the disaster it's no good trying to call it anything but that. The disaster for NASA is the worst since the first Apollo moon capsule burned on the launch pad on, that was January 27th, 1967, killing the 3 astronauts aboard the pad. A brilliant ball of flame erupted when this $1.1 billion shuttle exploded this morning. And shortly after the explosion, President Reagan's principal spokesman, Larry Speaks, came out at the White House to say simply and directly with sadness that President Reagan was aware of what had happened and was saddened and shocked by it, and that the president, along with other Americans, now simply had to wait for information as it comes in. Bill Plant is standing by at the White House now. Bill, has been any further information since that Speaks briefing, and what is the situation there? How much do they know?
Dan, they don't seem to know very much at all. In fact, they told us that they were getting the information from the news media, just as we were. They had no direct word from NASA about any survivors. There, frankly, doesn't seem to be much hope here. The president was told by the vice president and the national security advisor, Admiral Poindexter. They found him in the Oval Office where he was preparing to greet a group of news people and brief them on the State of the Union message. We were waiting for that briefing. We saw the national security advisor get up, confer with an aide, and leave. And within a minute or so after that, an advisor to Donald Reagan, the chief of staff, brought in a piece of paper. Reagan looked at it and said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you that the space shuttle has blown up." So President too, who after he was notified went in and watched the television coverage, he was reported to have watched in stunned silence, to have said nothing, is waiting for further details, Dan.
Thank you, Bill Plant at the White House. As we said, one of the astronauts aboard, schoolteacher Sharon Krista McAuliffe, was a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. Students there reportedly cheered loudly this morning when the Challenger first took off from the pad, and then they sat in stunned silence as the shuttle apparently exploded. Reporters and photographers were immediately ordered out of the school, and understandably so, and the students were ordered back to their classrooms. Let's take a look again at the videotape of what they saw as the Space Shuttle Challenger was lifted off this morning. This is about 3/4 of a minute into the flight.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
After that, no one knew what to say. On the basis of veteran space watchers, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has said nothing about what the cause of the explosion would be. But on the basis of veteran space watchers, what the most popular hypothesis at the moment is that the explosion may have been caused by the solid rocket boosters. Again, for those of you who may have joined us late, this is a scale model of the shuttle. The shuttle sits aboard its main fuel tank here, but off to the side are the solid rocket boosters, which are supposed to put it into orbit. The way this works, the solid rocket boosters are responsible for the launch and liftoff and getting into orbit. Then they're supposed to drop away once they have expended their solid rocket fuel, and then the shuttle, piggybacking on its main fuel tank, goes on up into orbit, and eventually is, always in the past, is separated from its main fuel tank, and then is in orbit and out there to do its work. The hypothesis at the moment, one of the theories is that because this happened 1 minute and 12 seconds into launch, while the solid rocket boosters were supposedly still doing their job, that the explosion may have been caused by something malfunctioning having to do with the solid rocket boosters. Now, Bruce Hall is at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The 7 crew members had breakfast, of course, this morning before their scheduled liftoff, and Bruce is with us at Cape Canaveral. Bruce?
Dan, we still have no official word from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The crew got up for breakfast. They were allowed to sleep a little late this morning because there was a problem at the launch pad. A faulty gauge first caused a delay of about an hour, so the crew had an extra hour's rest today. Some of the crew had already admitted they were a little frustrated by all the delays. We've had a considerable amount of weather delays and had a problem with the door yesterday, in that they could not get the door properly closed on the Space Shuttle Challenger, so they had to delay until the launch today. As they left this breakfast and made their only real public appearance this morning before going aboard the Challenger, Krista McAuliffe, the teacher, said it's going to go today. This was one time she expressed extreme confidence that they were going to be able to get into orbit and that they would make it today. Now, the Challenger, Dan, is the real workhorse of the shuttle fleet. The 4 shuttles, the Challenger has been up 10 times. It has been the one that is known among space people as the best of the shuttles. It was the one they seldom had trouble with. It was the one they were most confident with. So there was no real problem there. But the one thing that several people are talking about now, and there was great concern this morning, that is the freezing temperatures that we had. We had temperatures below 32 for about 10 to 12 hours. Starting about midnight last night, temperature dropped below 32. It finally dropped below 28, which is a crucial figure here. Once they go below 28, they figure that icicles are going to begin to form. And this morning, we did see a lot of icicles formed around the superstructure of the shuttle. One of the theories, and I must emphasize, this is only a theory. NASA has not said anything yet. But one of the theories that is being looked at is the possibility that some of those icicles may have fallen during launch or may have, at some point, when they were shaken loose, hit the solid rocket boosters, creating a small hole. And that is what could have created the explosion that occurred about 1 minute and 12 into the flight. But that is only a theory, and is one of many things that they are going to be looking at. NASA announced just a few moments ago, Dan, that they said everything that they had from the shuttle prior to the explosion indicated there was no problem. They did not have on a preliminary check. On a preliminary check, they had no reports of trouble aboard the shuttle before the explosion actually occurred.
Bruce, I want to ask what the atmosphere was among those at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration about how eager they were to get this shut off. But we try to strike a balance here for those who've been with our CBS News special report from the beginning and those who just may be joining us. We've had a terrible thing happen. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded into a gigantic fireball 1 minute and 12 seconds after liftoff this morning. The fate of the crew of 7, including the school teacher from New Hampshire aboard, unknown at this hour. But Bruce, NASA has been under extreme criticism. This pictures of the crew and school teacher McAuliffe. She's the second from the left on the top. Others aboard that flight, and lest we forget what brave people these were. Commander Francis Scobie, Michael J. Smith, who was the pilot, Judith Resnick, astronaut, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe from New Hampshire. Now, Bruce, I was asking you, NASA has been, for some little while, under tremendous pressure to get on schedule. What was the atmosphere the last couple of days about this particular Challenger shot, which had already been delayed a couple of times?
Well, Dan, there was some frustration here because this year was the first flight that went off. That was the flight that was delayed 7 times before they got it into orbit. And then once they got it into orbit with Congressman Bill Nelson aboard, they'd hoped to return here to the Kennedy Space Center. And because of the weather, they were not able to. There were 2 delays before they could bring it down, and they finally had to bring it down in California. So once we started getting into delays here with the Challenger, there was some frustration. A lot of people were getting very concerned because NASA had an extremely ambitious schedule for this year. 15 flights, which is the most they've attempted in any year, and they were really concerned that the schedule was going to get backed up. There was a desire to get this off, if at all possible. Once before, when they'd had freezing temperatures, they'd had to postpone a mission that was 1 year ago today, I believe, and they wanted to make certain that they could get this off. However, I must emphasize, Dan, NASA is always extremely concerned about safety. If anything, they are very conservative. They have come in for a lot of criticism from the media over the years because they have been so conservative. Every time they want to make any repairs, they always have a backup. They have a redundancy system to everything. So while there had been criticism, NASA had said, we prefer to go the safe route, and therefore they would take that extra precaution. But there clearly was frustration because of the building number of delays that have occurred here in recent weeks.
Well, as we wait for further official word from Mission Control in Houston or anyone else with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration about what happened this morning as the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded with a crew of 7, including the school teacher aboard. Bruce, I want to ask you, if you can, to amplify a bit on why the temperature, you mentioned 28 degrees Fahrenheit, was considered to be a critical temperature for those connected with the launch. Now, they went ahead with the launch. Explain to me why that 28-degree mark was so important, and also I'm not quite certain whether it got down to 28 degrees this morning in Florida.
Well, the case is here, Dan, that 32, of course, is freezing. But once the temperature drops below about 28, that is when the icicles really begin to form. If the temperature drops to 30, 31, generally in Florida, particularly here right along the coastline with the prevailing winds coming off of the water, icicles generally do not form. But once the temperature starts going below 28, then you have the icicles forming on the superstructure at the shuttle. And one of the things they're always concerned about anytime you have a launch is that nothing hits the shuttle itself. Particularly, if you may recall a few months ago when the shuttle was being transported back from California, it went for just 45 seconds through a rainstorm and it pelted those heat shield tiles, and they had to replace about 1,400. It destroyed them. So they want to make certain that the icicles are not formed. They had several ice inspection teams go to the pad shortly before launch. In fact, we delayed the launch an extra hour. NASA delayed the launch an extra hour so that the ice inspection teams could go to check on the weather conditions at the pad and to make certain that none of the icicles were causing any problems. However, we did see a number of pictures this morning from the pad area as late as, I would say, an hour before the actual launch, where you could see icicles of about 6 or 8 inches in length. There were some reports that in some areas there were icicles 2 feet in length, but you couldn't be sure about that. All we saw were icicles of 6 to 8 inches. I've just been told that NASA says that rescue crews are now arriving in the impact area. It says that the debris just stopped falling, and they have found nothing so far. We have no official word on the condition. We all saw the explosion when we've rerun that tape on several occasions. But the paramedics have gone into the area. They've been parachuted into the area. Ships are en route. And according to NASA, the rescue crews are now arriving in the impact area a few miles off the coast here at the Kennedy Space Center.
Bruce, we know how dangerous these flights can be, and in some ways, you and I and others who've covered this over the years have said to ourselves any number of times what a miracle it is that there haven't been more disasters, that never before in flight has a U.S. manned flight had a disaster of this sort. There was the time on the pad when 3 astronauts were killed in the 1960s, but never in flight before. What is considered to be the most dangerous time, liftoff to touchdown back in the shuttle program? We were in the first minute and 12 seconds this morning. That's clearly a dangerous time. When is considered the most dangerous time?
Well, we were right in the period that is considered the most dangerous time, because in that period from liftoff to the separation of the solid rocket boosters, 2 minutes and 7 seconds into liftoff, that is the time that is generally considered to be the most dangerous. There are 2 periods they really are concerned about. That is the first 15 seconds off the pad while it clears the pad area, and they determine that there are no immediate problems from something connected with the pad. And then starting at about a minute in, and this time we had the explosion at a minute 12, from about a minute to 2:07, this is the period when the determination is made if they're going into a proper course, a proper orbit, and that everything is working okay. And it is during that time that the thrust changes. We were just given some information that the astronauts were beginning to throttle their engines up to maximum thrust just about the time the explosion occurred. And after that, they throttled down to a 60% level to reduce the force. So during the period of the explosion was during the period of maximum thrust with the space shuttle, and one of the 2 most dangerous periods during the entire mission.
Well, Bruce, the commander of this particular Space Shuttle Challenger flight was Francis Dick Scobie, and as best anyone can make out, his final words to Mission Control before that tremendous fireball after launch this morning, his final words were, quote, "Roger, go at throttle up." Could you translate that for us? Does that mean go to full throttle?
That normally means go to full throttle, something that they're doing 35 seconds into the launch. 35 seconds after they leave the pad, they go to full throttle, and they will remain at full throttle through the separation of the solid rocket boosters. And that is most likely what he meant at that time. And there is no indication from NASA that they had any indication, and there's no indication there's any communication from the crew indicating they knew of any difficulties prior to the explosion itself. Now, Dan, I also must tell you that while they have been on the pad, we've had 25 launches of the space shuttle. 10 different times we've had mechanical delays which have required a delay of at least 1 day in the launch. 6 different times we have had delays with weather problems. So 16 different times we have had delays on the launch pad prior to the launch itself. But we, of course, have never had anything happen like we had today.
Bruce, Krista McAuliffe's parents, Krista McAuliffe being the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who was aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger flight this morning, her parents, Edward and Grace Corrigan, were among those watching the launch from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration VIP site about 3.5 miles from the launch pad. When they realized what had happened, the school teacher's parents hugged each other and cried. NASA officials shielded them immediately from spectators. We told you earlier the story about the children at the school where Krista McAuliffe taught, seeing the launch and applauding as Space Shuttle Challenger got off the pad, and then watching in horror that awful fireball. And then immediately after that, all media people, press people, understandably, were escorted from the school, and the children were escorted back to their various classrooms. They'd been gotten together for the specific purpose of watching the liftoff this morning. We do have photographs of the crew, pictures taken this morning of the crew before the liftoff from the launch pad. As Bruce said, the crew was allowed to sleep in a little later this morning because there was anticipated some delays in the preparation. If we have those on videotape now, perhaps we can and should take a look at them. Well, we may not have them available just at this moment. No, here they are.
This is Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger.
This excited, nervous school teacher is polishing the lessons she will teach from outer space.
Here, so I can explain to the kids that everything has to be held down because otherwise...
School children from all over the country will tune in on public television. Quite a change from a year ago, when our biggest audience was the social studies class at Concord High School in New Hampshire. McAuliffe became one of America's best-known teachers when she was picked from more than 11,000 applicants to be the first private citizen to get a ride on the shuttle.
I thought there was never going to be any more excitement. I mean, I could never peak any higher than I had on July 19th, and it just keeps building.
She hopes her trip is going to spread the idea that space is for everyone, and especially the students in today's classrooms. McAuliffe had to become a student all over again, learning how to be an astronaut, where a sleek T-38 jet can serve as the study hall.
It was wonderful. He broke the sound barrier, and he let me fly for a while.
There were many lessons to be learned, fighting fires and driving the emergency escape vehicle.
There are a lot of students back at Concord High School who would love to have that opportunity.
She has become a hero back in Concord, and her husband has become a space enthusiast.
If I could nudge her aside and climb aboard, I think it'd be a fight.
And there's also a little competition from daughter Caroline.
I think it's neat to go into outer space.
This doesn't seem possible.
It was an emotional experience as she watched the launch of the shuttle last October.
Oh, it's beautiful!
She thinks it will be even more beautiful when she can share the experience with the nation's school children. Bruce Hall, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Dan. Recapping now some of the information that we do know and what we still don't know. Moments after the much-delayed Space Shuttle Challenger took off from its Florida launch pad in a hard freeze this morning, the vehicle carrying the 7 astronauts, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe, whom you just saw in that report prepared some time ago by Bruce Hall, the whole space shuttle exploded. NASA says there was no indication of any problem with the engines, but the explosion occurred at about the time the Challenger was to enter a period of peak aerodynamic pressure, when wind and other conditions would be exerting the maximum force on the shuttle, and when they were about to throttle up again to full power on the engines. Recovery vehicles off the coast of Florida apparently spotted debris. They were delayed getting into the area they wanted to reach because of some of the debris, but so far no word of any survivors. And to note again, this particular shuttle was not equipped with any ejection seats. Bill Plant is standing by at the White House to recap for us what has happened this morning. But before we go to Bill Plant, let me again make use of our scale model here, so we get the best understanding that we possibly can of what you see when we show you the videotape of the launch and the explosion in air. This is the configuration scale model of the space shuttle as it sits on the launch pad. This being the space shuttle, this being its main fuel tank, these two being the solid rocket boosters. Now, what happens on the launch pad is the solid rocket boosters have the primary responsibility for getting the space shuttle, the whole configuration, off of the pad. Remember that you have basically three engine sources, primary engine sources. You have the two solid rocket boosters off to the side. The space shuttle itself has these engines, which is hard to see, but right down in here behind it. But those engines have to have fuel. And of course, this is the large fuel tank. The solid rocket boosters alone are not enough to get the space shuttle into orbit. The solid rocket boosters get it off the pad, point it toward orbit, then the solid rocket boosters are supposed to fall away off to the side, and the space shuttle with its engines down here, drawing on fuel from this huge tank, takes itself on toward orbit, eventually drops away its main fuel tank, and then the space shuttle goes on into orbit with its small engines in the tail of it back here. Now, this morning, when the explosion happened, it was only 1 minute and 12 seconds into launch. The whole apparatus, the last anybody saw before the great fireball, was in place and doing its job. The solid rocket boosters carrying the shuttle toward its orbit, but only 1 minute and 12 seconds in, and it was, as Bruce Hall told us earlier, one of the 2 or 3 most dangerous periods of any launch. Now, with that information, as best I can pass it along to you, let's take a look at the videotape as to what happened after launch this morning.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Videotape of what remained of the space shuttle after that tremendous fireball explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
what remains of Space Shuttle Challenger plunging toward the sea off Cape Canaveral. Now, while it is impossible to say exactly what caused the explosion this morning, no one can say what caused the explosion. And the National Aeronautics and Space Administration seems to be puzzled at this moment as to what could have caused it.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that
this is the slow motion replay of the accident. And watch this now. This is slow motion replay of the accident, indicates what happened. You can see a small explosion apparently on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters. Then a few seconds later, the main huge explosion and the fireball that appears to consume the Challenger. Awful as it is, let us take this videotape, if you will, and control back to the beginning, because with what little we know about this story, it may be important that people understand what you can see and what you can't see. And we're going to show you in slow motion why it's now, as we take a close look at it, you can tell what happened. Now, this is normal motion. Now, close up, you see. Now, that's normal motion. Now, let's take slow motion coming back and watch the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And you'll see that the explosion apparently started on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters. And then a few seconds later, the main huge explosion and fireball that just obliterated the Challenger. Let's take it in slow motion here, if we may. Now, re-rack that to show the slow motion. While they're doing that, when we say the solid rocket boosters, we're talking about these are the solid rocket boosters. And now, when we see it in slow motion, we can clearly see the explosion happen on the right side, first on the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters, and then there was the major explosion. Now, let's take a look at the slow motion replay. See the Challenger riding as it's supposed to. Then that small explosion on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters, followed by the greater and main explosion. All of this happening a minute and 12 seconds into this morning's launch. The 56 times NASA has put a man, at least one human, into space. Now, on the upper right-hand side, pardon me for interrupting, but you can now see this is terrifying and fascinating as you see the slow motion. Look at your picture, upper right-hand quadrant of the picture. You can see the long pencil-like extension away from the explosion, upper right-hand corner of your screen. That is one of the solid rocket boosters blown apart from the space shuttle, as the space shuttle, its main fuel tank, and the shuttle itself and the other solid rocket booster are completely obliterated. And you can see, emphasize again, that in the slow motion, that the first explosion occurred on the right-hand side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And as Bruce Hall said earlier, there was a hard freeze in Florida this morning, and one of the theories, underscore, italicize, all caps, one of the theories is that perhaps some icicles formed by the hard freeze coming off the Space Shuttle Challenger may have caused the explosion in one of these solid rocket boosters. Now, Bill Plant, our White House correspondent, is at the White House where Larry Speaks, President Reagan's principal spokesman, briefed earlier and then very sadly a bit earlier on in the morning. Bill, do we know anything more at the White House? Do they know anything more now about what may have happened?
Dan, there's been nothing new that's come in here. They're still watching. They're still waiting, listening to NASA. There is, I understand, a direct link now between the White House and NASA. But as far as we know, they've been able to tell them nothing new. The president reacted with stunned silence, we're told. When he was informed about this by the vice president and the national security advisor, he was in the Oval Office when he heard the news. He stepped into the small room next to the Oval Office where there's a television set, and we're told then turned it on and looked at the video replays, which we have just seen. It's a very tough moment for this White House. Perhaps the more so because of the message of hope and optimism that Mr. Reagan is planning to sound tonight at the State of the Union address. We are told, Dan, though, that The president will certainly mention something about this tonight in his State of the Union.
Bill, was consideration given to not having the State of the Union tonight, to postponing it?
Not as far as we know, Dan. That's one of the first questions that was asked of Larry Speaks, the president's spokesman, and he indicated that they hadn't talked about that yet or thought about it. We did see the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, at the time that this was all learned. There were a group of reporters in for a briefing about the State of the Union. We saw the National Security Advisor, Admiral Poindexter, get up and talk to an aide and walk out. And then a moment later, someone brought in a note to Regan, the Chief of Staff. He looked down, he read it, and said, "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that the space shuttle has blown up." And that's about when the president learned. So they really have had very little chance to do anything but be shocked, as we all were.
Well, Bill, the State of the Union message is scheduled for 9 o'clock this evening Eastern Time, 8 o'clock Central Time. There still is a chance, there still is time for them to change their mind about going ahead with it, but your emphasis for the moment is that you've been told that the president does intend to go ahead with the State of the Union tonight as scheduled.
That's right, Dan, as far as we know now.
Thank you, Bill. School teacher Chris McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, as we mentioned earlier, were at the Cape this morning at a VIP site about 3 miles from the actual launch. They were watching the launch. Here's what happened. Parents of schoolteacher McAuliffe as they watched the space shuttle launch this morning, a launch that began for them with great pride and joy and ended in tears. Before that awful moment, everything seemed fine as the astronauts ate breakfast before the launch.
Cornell crew enjoying breakfast.
Dan, this was the astronauts as they were having breakfast earlier this morning. It was a very happy group. They were very pleased to be going on this shuttle. Ellison Onizuka, and you saw Krista McAuliffe. And as they had breakfast, there was the traditional cake wishing them good luck. For identification purposes, you have Judy Resnick and Ron McNair there, and Greg Jarvis. They were all ready to go and anxious to go after several delays, and as they left the breakfast area and left the building where they had been spending the time, Krista McAuliffe said, "It's going to go today." Krista McAuliffe was looking forward to this flight. She was extremely anxious. She felt after several months of training now she had become part of the team. She still considered herself a teacher rather than an astronaut, but she felt that she had become part of the team. The NASA now has some cameras that have reached the scene of the incident, and I don't know if you're able to see this in New York, Dan, but I can tell here we see several pieces of debris that are out into the ocean, which appear, from every indication we have here, to be, maybe 3, 4, or 5 miles off the coast of Florida here at the Kennedy Space Center. It appears in looking at the screen that there are small pieces of debris scattered over a wide area. This is a NASA plane that is flying over the impact area. According to the first reports from people on the scene, that it was just small pieces showered down for several seconds, and almost it seemed like several minutes. However, it is more likely that it was a few seconds. You can see in the center of your screen, as they zoom in, small pieces from the Space Shuttle Challenger. And these are the first scenes from the recovery operation. NASA has sent several paramedics into the area. The paramedics are now in the water, and they are looking for any evidence that they can find or the possibility of any survivors. These are the first pictures that we've been able to see from the recovery scene just a few miles off the Kennedy Space Center. It appears from looking at this that these are relatively small pieces. This is a very large, the shuttle is very large, along with the solid rocket boosters. And what we are able to see in the ocean itself appear to be quite small pieces, relatively speaking. Somewhat similar to what you have seen as the results of a number of plane crashes, when there has been an explosion and there's just very little left.
We do want to point out that these are live pictures from the recovery area, which is a short distance east of the United States mainland off Florida. Since the explosion aboard Space Shuttle Challenger happened this morning, only 1 minute and 12 seconds into flight. And given the size, the huge fireball, one is not surprised to see so little debris in the water there. Bruce, it may be worth we've had some questions. Clearly, anything as complicated as one of these space shuttle launches about what could have happened there. Perhaps what we should do is, again, talk about at what stage the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning was in during the launch and the liftoff, and what appears to have happened. Now, what we will try to do is, do you have a model there, Bruce, or not?
Dan, I do not have a model here in front of me. I think I'll have one here in a couple of minutes. The
help me as we go.
Have been using has been very good in the way that you have been explaining it. And connected with that, the stop-action videotape that you have been looking at, you can actually see the point of where the explosion occurred. Now, there are several possibilities here, and you must realize that NASA has made no announcement at all. But for those people who have viewed a number of these flights, there are several things come to mind immediately. At the point in the flight when the explosion took place, there was 250,000 gallons a second of superfluids, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, flowing to the engines. And it was during that point, approximately 1 minute 12 into the flight, that it appeared from the stop-action videotape that a small explosion occurred, a very small one, and then a major explosion in the main tank. This is the tank where all of the fuel is stored. This is a tank that is not reusable. It normally drops off over the Indian Ocean. But this was completely full at the time. And when that main explosion, that is the fireball that you saw. It is that main tank exploding. It appeared to us here, those of us who were looking at the videotape that you were showing, there was a very small, just a second or maybe even a millisecond prior to the main explosion, a smaller ignition or a little explosion in the solid rocket booster, as you indicated earlier. But it is a time when they're at full thrust, 104% thrust, they call it here. It is the time during the shuttle mission when there is the most power during the entire flight. And after they get into orbit and the solid rocket boosters fall away at just after 2 minutes into the flight, then they throttle back to 60% of thrust. But at the time the explosion occurred, it was the time when the thrust was at the strongest point of any time during a shuttle trip.
Just to underscore that, Bruce, and we've been trying to explain as best we can as we go along what appears to have happened this morning. We're going to do three things. We're going to review what the procedure is, where the engines are, and where the thrust come from. Then we're going to show you the real-time videotape of the launch this morning, and then the explosion a minute and 12 seconds into launch. Then we're going to stop and show you in slow motion some of just what Bruce Hall was talking about. Now, to review what Bruce said with our model here, and forgive me, I'm not an expert on spacecraft, and if the explanation seems a little awkward, I know that you will understand that. But we want you to understand how the shuttle works, review that for you, and so you can have a better understanding of what happened this morning. The shuttle, again, it has its own 3 engines back here, right down at the base of the shuttle. The shuttle has its own 3 engines. Now, those 3 engines go off of liquid hydrogen fuel. These 3 main engines operate off liquid hydrogen fuel. Liquid oxygen and explosive liquid hydrogen fuel feed these 3 engines. But these 3 engines built into the spacecraft itself are not enough to get it off the launch pad. So they have these solid rocket fuel engines built onto the side. Component parts, solid rocket fuel engines. You know, the kind of rockets that the Germans made such good use of in the one stage of World War II. But that's solid fuel in these rockets. And these rockets have tremendous thrust, and that helps get this whole, the space shuttle itself, its main liquid oxygen and explosive liquid hydrogen tank that it rides piggyback on, helps these liquid solid fuel rockets help get the whole thing off the pad. The little engines, comparatively small engines, in the tail of the space shuttle not being enough to get it off the pad and head it toward orbit. Now, the plan and what happens and what has always happened before, once it gets off the pad, once it gets headed toward orbit, and the solid rocket boosters have done their job, then they are to fall away. You've seen that happen so many times on our videotape with previous shots. That leaves the space shuttle riding piggyback on the source of its liquid fuel, the liquid oxygen and the explosive liquid hydrogen fuel in here. Now, what happened this morning, all of these component parts were still together as they should have been. After the liftoff, they're still together. And what you're going to see as we go through the real-time videotape replay and the slow motion is that it appears that the first explosion is on the right-hand side of one of these liquid, one of these solid rocket boosters. Now, let's go to the real-time videotape replay first and then the slow motion.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control program. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up.
One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The explosion has occurred. Mission control on Houston at this moment, this morning, just after the explosion, simply didn't know what had happened. Smoke trails, debris begins to fall.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Obviously a major malfunction, meaning a catastrophe in the sky as Space Challenger sought to explore the high frontier. Now let's take a look at what happened at the critical moments in slow motion. All of the Space Shuttle and Challenger, its fuel tank and the solid rocket boosters intact. We're about 3/4 a minute into it. Now, stop right there. You can see the first explosion appears to happen at the right side of one of those solid rocket fuel boosters. And then the liquid fuel, liquid oxygen and highly explosive liquid hydrogen fuel on which the space shuttle is riding also goes up and creates the fireball. That a slow motion replay of the videotape, and if we can go again now live to the recovery area, if we still have that capacity, the search for debris and survivors, this is the scene. This is a live shot from on board a NASA aircraft in the area. Very little debris spotted. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration still has no explanation, has put forward not even any theories as to what it believes may have happened this morning. Bruce Hall mentioned that many veteran observers put forward the hypothesis, nothing more than that, that because of the deep freeze in Florida, unusual for Florida, the deep freeze this morning, that some icicles could have been, may have been, possibly have been created, and that one theory, nothing more than that, is that the icicles could have in some way been knocked off the space shuttle as it was going up and was knocked into the explosive fuel on which the shuttle was riding. We're told that First Lady Nancy Reagan was watching the launch alone in the White House this morning in the family quarters, and that she exclaimed, "Oh my God, no," when she saw that fireball that we showed you. David Martin, our Pentagon correspondent, is at the Defense Department at the moment with details about the recovery operation. David?
Dan, the recovery operation is being run by the Coast Guard, which had two cutters in the area at the time. There were no U.S. Navy ships in the immediate area. You have the two Coast Guard cutters, a third cutter that is close to the area, all three of them converging on the site of where this debris has rained down. There is a report, and we cannot confirm it from here yet, that the actual recovery operation was delayed somewhat to stay out of the area while all this debris rained down. There are two Navy ships en route to the area. One's about 45 minutes away. The other is about 2 hours away. They, I don't think, will be any use in the immediate search for any possible survivors, but I think there will be a wide search of the area trying to recover all possible debris in an attempt to figure out what happened here.
David, it's worth emphasizing that this is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a civilian agency that is responsible for the space shuttle launches, as they have been for all of them, and as they have been for the entire United States space program. The decision was made in the late 1950s and implemented all through the 1960s to make America's space program a civilian space program. And while we indeed have some military uses for our space program, our way, the American style, has been to make it a civilian space agency as opposed to the military space agency of the Soviet Union.
That's right, although the Air Force was going to become one of the prime users of the space shuttle because they were going to use it originally as the sole means for putting all U.S. military satellites into space. But because of so many difficulties that had occurred on earlier flights, the Air Force had insisted on retaining the capability to launch some high-priority satellites with its own rockets. Now, of course, that we have lost, apparently, one entire shuttle, which, if you think about it for a moment, is the equivalent of the Air Force in one brief moment losing a quarter of all its airplanes. It's a major catastrophe, just not only in terms of the lives involved here, but in terms of the equipment. And now that that is lost, it is going to throw this program of cooperation between the military and the civilian NASA agency into great disarray, I would think.
Thank you, David Martin at the Pentagon. Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in air in a huge fireball this morning just after 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. 1 minute and 12 seconds into launch. No word on the fate of the 7 humans aboard the space shuttle. That would have been the crew plus the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire. No word on any survivors. As you saw from the recovery area, only small portions of debris could even be seen in the sea east of Florida. We want now to review who was aboard that space shuttle, who these explorers, the space voyagers, were. Francis Dick Scobie, Air Force Major 46, born in Washington State, was the commander. Michael Smith, who was the pilot, age 40, U.S. Navy, born in Morehead City, North Carolina. Judy Resnick, astronaut, 36 years old, Ph.D., born in Akron, Ohio. All of these members of the crew. Ronald McNair, another Ph.D., 35 years old, born in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka, Major, U.S. Air Force, 39 years old, born in Hawaii. And 41-year-old Gregory Jorvis, born in Detroit, crew member. And then the special passenger aboard this Space Shuttle Challenger, Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old, school teacher, mother out of Concord, New Hampshire. Those were the Americans aboard this morning's Space Shuttle Challenger launch. As you may have heard us report earlier, the school children from the school of school teacher Krista McAuliffe were called together at the school this morning to watch the launch. They watched and applauded as the launch got off, noting that Bruce Hall said later that close observers of the launch thought that the Space Shuttle Challenger was getting up a little slower this morning than was usual for such launches. Of course, those school children had no way of knowing that, and they applauded as the Space Shuttle Challenger seemed to get off all right, and then they watched in horror as in doing the live shot of the takeoff as that big fireball appeared, and it was clear that something went wrong. Correspondent Eric Ingberg reports now that an inquiry panel is to be established to investigate the cause of today's accident as per standard NASA procedures. The makeup of the panel, when it will start its work, still being evaluated. Of course, as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration tries to figure out not only what happened this morning, you can see in the videotape, both the real-time videotape and the slow-motion videotape, some of what happened, but of course what NASA wants to know is why it happened. This is the first time there's been such a disaster during a space flight. In 1967, 3 astronauts in the Apollo program, the program that eventually put the United States on the moon. During that program, 3 astronauts died in an accident on the launch pad. This is the first disaster in space for the United States. 7 persons aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. Their fates cannot be absolutely determined at this hour. Again, we are told that President Reagan watched in, quote, stunned silence as the shuttle exploded this morning. We're told that the president was watching the liftoff live from Florida. President Reagan's spokesman, Larry Speaks, is saying that the president will go ahead with his State of the Union address tonight. Said Speaks, and I quote him, "I'm certain the president will feel compelled to mention this tragedy depending on the outcome." That's unquote Larry Speaks. Now, President Reagan's State of the Union address will be carried live this evening on CBS. That will be at 9 o'clock tonight Eastern Time, 8 o'clock, of course, Central Time, and 6 o'clock in the West. Now, we want to emphasize that there's much unknown about what happened this morning and why it happened. Here now is an animated sequence. This is animation showing how the launch should have gone. At 2 minutes into the flight, the shuttle's 2 boosters, the solid rocket boosters, should separate from the spacecraft itself. That would be 2 minutes in. The spacecraft never got to that point. The boosters would plunge into the ocean after they'd done their job of helping get the spaceship headed toward orbit, and they'd be retrieved for further use, those solid rocket boosters. And now that's how today's launch of Space Shuttle Challenger should have gone. Instead, this is what happens, or appears to have happened. At less than 2 minutes into the flight, at about 1 minute and 12 seconds, there was an explosion. After what seemed to be an ordinary launch. The explosion seems to be on the right side of one of those solid launch boosters, solid rocket fuel boosters. Pieces of the 100-ton spacecraft began to come down into the water about 28 miles downrange from the launch site. The first explosion seemed to be in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters. The next explosion consumed the liquid fuel on which the space shuttle rides and consumed the whole space shuttle, the solid rocket boosters, the liquid fuel tank, and the space shuttle itself. Bruce Hall at Cape Canaveral now has more on what may have happened to the engines. Bruce?
Dan, we have been operating on the theory, although we have heard absolutely nothing from NASA about this, but the first people who were reviewing the tape, just as you have been saying, it appeared there was a possible small explosion or some type of ignition in the solid rocket booster, and then there was a major explosion in the main tank. Now, people have had the opportunity to review these tapes, to look at the slow motion as we have been doing. A second theory, and I must emphasize, Dan, this is only a theory. A second theory is coming to the forefront now, and that is that an explosion took place first in the main engine tank, and it occurred right at the seam, at the point where the orbiter, the Space Shuttle Challenger, is attached to the main fuel tank. I now have a small model here with me, nothing like the larger one that you have, but if you can see right in at the very point on this tank, if you can hold it, it's about to fall on this, but there is a place where the Shuttle Challenger is attached to the main tank. It is the theory here, among others, that it very well could have been a seam on the main tank. These are not reusable tanks like the solid rocket boosters. These are used once and are ejected over the Indian Ocean and go into the ocean. But the theory is a possibility that there was a rupture right along the seam next to the point where the Space Shuttle Challenger is attached to the main tank. The orbiter is attached at that point, and this was a point during maximum thrust, if you will recall. This is the point in the mission where you have absolute full thrust, and the last words that we heard from the Space Shuttle said, "Roger, go to throttle up." That's go to throttle up. That is to go to maximum thrust. And within a second or two after that point, it is when it appears the explosion took place. Now, I must emphasize again, Dan, these are only theories. We have not heard anything from NASA. These are the theories of people who are looking at the tapes here, and they are also looking in slow motion, trying to make some determination. I'm sure that we will have further definitive word from NASA later on. One thing I do want to mention in regard to the crew, we've talked about the 7 astronauts. This crew was one that they were particularly interested because of the Krista McAuliffe going along with them. The commander of the crew, Dick Scobie's wife, is a prominent educator, and she was extremely proud by the fact that a teacher was going on this particular flight. It was also a flight that Greg Jarvis was very happy to be on. Greg Jarvis is a person who had been bumped from 2 flights. He had been bumped from the flight which Senator Jake Garn went on. He was later bumped from the flight which Congressman Bill Nelson went on. So this was a man who twice had been bumped from flights. He was extremely excited about going into this. He was very confident. He was comfortable. And during this time while we have been waiting for the liftoff, we had the opportunity several times to meet with Krista McAuliffe's parents. Her parents said that they had trepidation about this flight and that they were concerned and they were a little scared. But they said that their daughter, Krista, said, "This was what I want to do. I am so proud I'm able to represent my profession. I am so proud and confident and feel good about the chance that we have for the field of education, to what we can do for education." So they said, despite any trepidation that they had, they were just extremely proud for their daughter, and they were very hopeful for her. And as we saw a few moments ago, pictures of them at the period of the launch, there were tears in their eyes. That was from the happiness, I believe, because they know how much she had worked toward this flight. And Krista said before leaving, "I now feel part of this crew. I am a teacher first, but I really feel as part of this crew."
Bruce, we've mentioned it several times that it was so easy to forget when things were going well how dangerous spaceflight can be and is. That one is reminded of the old seaman saying that thy sea is so great and my boat is so small. The sky, of course, is even greater than the sea in size, and pilots have a saying that although the sea is unforgiving, the sky is even more unforgiving. No one can say what happened aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning when it exploded 1 minute and 12 seconds into its flight. That's a very interesting point you make, Bruce, that we need to keep emphasizing that while NASA has said nothing about what happened, you can clearly see from the videotape, which we will, of course, show again as we go along with our live coverage from CBS News, but you see the explosion happen. Bruce had his small model, and we go back to the large model here. You can see on the slow motion of the videotape that the explosion happens. We said one theory was that it seemed to start maybe in the solid fuel rocket booster, the solid rocket booster, one of those. It seemed to start out there. And one of the theories, one of the working theories only, is that the explosion happened on the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters first, and then spread to the main tank on which the shuttle rides, in which you have, among other things, this explosive liquid hydrogen in there. Now, that was the first theory put forward, one of the hypotheses put forward. Now, Bruce is mentioning the possibility, underscore the word possibility, that in a close looking at the slow motion of the videotape, that some observers, not the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, some observers say, well, it seems that the explosion may not have actually happened in the solid rocket booster itself, but seemed to perhaps have happened, as Bruce pointed out, right in this area, the solid rocket booster attached to the main fuel tank where most of the explosive material is, and these solid rocket boosters supposedly will drop away later. They never got to that point today. Some say, well, now, perhaps you can see in the close-up there are seams in this big tank. This is the main fuel tank. There are seams. There's a seam here, and there's a seam down here. Now, the explosion, to some eyes, seems to have occurred right at this point, and so there is speculation, nothing more than that, and a theory that perhaps the explosion began in the main fuel tank itself at one of those seams. Now, it's only a theory, but Bruce, would the very low temperature in Florida this morning, 28 degrees, well below freezing on the Fahrenheit scale, have had anything to do with the ability of those seams on the main fuel tank to stand up?
Dan, I'm sorry. Now we have just restored our audio line. I did not hear your question now.
Not a problem, Bruce, and I'm sure the audience understands this is live coverage. The question is, would the low temperatures, the 28-degree temperature in Florida this morning, have affected the seams on that main fuel tank at all?
That is one of the things that they're going to be taking a very, very close look at here, because with the low temperatures, and the fact that the temperature did drop down below 28 degrees, which is a crucial one, the crucial temperature here, because that's when the icicles begin to form, and when they're forming on the shuttle gantry, there is a possibility, and there is a strong possibility that some of the icicles could have formed in connection with the main shuttle fuel tank. The fuel tank itself, the brown, orange-looking tank that you see right there on the launch pad. There was some concern. We saw a lot of icicles at the base of the launch pad about an hour before the shuttle lifted off. So we don't know if they were actually on the main fuel tank, but it is a very distinct possibility. You can see there long icicles. We were told their icicles were 2 feet in length. That appears to be actually even longer than 2 feet in length. And as the cameras panned the launch area earlier today, about an hour before the launch itself, you saw a lot of areas where there were icicles. So it is not just in a few areas where you can find the icicles. You found the icicles on the gantry around the launch pad and also right around the engine area. And an ice inspection team was called to the pad. We delayed the launch. NASA delayed the launch by approximately 1 hour, in addition to the earlier malfunction. So the launch itself went off 2 hours later than scheduled. But it was delayed the last time as they brought in an ice inspection team to check the shuttle, to check the solid rocket boosters, to check the main fuel tank, and to, most importantly, check the gantry area right around the launch pad, where there still were, at the time of launch, a considerable amount of ice. There were a lot of icicles that you can see formed on the edges of the launch pad itself. The main concern, of course, is whether there was any ice on the shuttle or on the solid rocket boosters or main fuel tank. The icicles that we see here are in reality on the pad itself rather than the shuttle. Right there you saw the icicles on the stairway going up the launch pad. This is a newly refurbished launch pad. It is the first time that a shuttle has taken off from this launch pad. The previous 24 launches have been from pad 39A. This is pad 39B. The last time that it was used was 10 years ago with the joint Russian-U.S. space probe, and it has been refurbished in the last 2 years so that the shuttle program would be able to take advantage of that, and they would be able to increase the number of launches. One thing, there are no ejection seats on the space shuttle. There were ejection seats on the first several shuttles. First 4 flights of the shuttle, they had ejection seats. They were taken out for 2 reasons. Reason 1, when we increased the size of the crew, and this time we had a crew of 7, there was not enough room left in the shuttle to have ejection seats, and it could not take care of 7 people. So those were taken out after the first 4 flights, the experimental flights of the shuttle. They removed those. There also was a theory backed by most people in the space program that if there was an emergency aboard the space shuttle, there is no way that anyone could eject and survive. So because of the fact that they did not believe anyone could survive and they needed the extra room, after 4 flights of the space shuttle, they removed the ejection seats to give them more room, because it is, after all, a very cramped area. The shuttle itself is large, but the area where most of the people have to work and where the people live for the days in space is very small, and it is extremely cramped, and they needed every extra inch that they could take.
Bruce, just to underscore that point, most people who followed the Space Shuttle program know this, but your point that you just made was that the basic area where the crew and the astronauts and the passengers is just in here, that most of the Space Shuttle is taken up by the cargo bays. You can see on our scale model here how small the actual space for the passengers and crew is compared to the shuttle overall. These cargo bay doors open up in the space shuttle, and this is where the satellites are thrown out into space, and other work is done in this cargo area. But Bruce's point is well taken, that one tends to forget how very small the area is for the passengers and crew. Today, 7 passengers and crew, 6 crew members, the 7th being the passenger, Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. No sign of any survivors after the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up in that fireball this morning. Bruce, for clarity, you mentioned that this was, check me as we go along here, the 24th Space Shuttle shot. There have been 56 United States manned space shots. Never before has there been a disaster in actual flight. The last time astronauts were killed was in 1967 when 3 were killed on the pad as part of the Apollo program. Now, we're going to take you from the launch pad right through the videotape, first the real-time videotape of what happened this morning, and then go to the slow motion once again. For those of you who've been with us throughout our live coverage, you've seen this before. We are aware that many in our audience are joining us for the first time. This was the scene. All those icicles that Bruce mentioned before are around. There's been an icicle inspection, but they've decided to go ahead with the launch. This is what happened.
Of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling program. Program initiator. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
Lujan or Lujan?
Right. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
Leslie Stone.
We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go and throttle up. Roger, go and throttle up.
One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Roger, go with throttle up. The last words heard from Space Shuttle Challenger. The fireball, the smoke, the debris plunging toward the ocean just east of the Cape Canaveral launch site. Now, for the critical moments of today's disaster, here is slow motion videotape just before the explosion. You can see the first explosion. Hard to tell whether it happens on the main liquid tank or in the solid rocket fuel boosters. Then the devastating wipeout explosion. And carry it a little bit forward because you can see one of the, in the upper right-hand part of your screen, we think you can see one of the solid rocket fuel boosters just sticking out and being blown away. There it is in the upper right-hand quadrant of your screen. One of the two solid rocket fuel boosters at this stage still at least partially intact, being blown away from that fireball. That a slow motion replay of the terrible moment this morning, just past 11:30 Eastern time, when the explosion occurred, destroying Space Shuttle Challenger. Now coming up on almost 2 hours since the explosion of the Space Shuttle, NASA still has made no official announcement on the fate of the 7 aboard the Challenger, though no survivors have been sighted. We've been showing you regularly throughout our coverage the live pictures provided by NASA of the scene where the debris, some debris has been sighted in the ocean east of Florida. It's just beyond this land where the debris is. It's very near the launch site itself out in the ocean because, after all, the explosion occurred only 1 minute and 12 seconds into the flight. Now, let us pause and review for you what we think we know as of this hour. Still no official announcement from NASA as to the fate of the crew of 6 and the school teacher passenger aboard the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded into that gigantic fireball about 1 minute and 12 seconds after liftoff. Apparently, underscore that word, apparently, all seven members aboard the flight were killed. I emphasize again, as Bruce Hall has been doing, that there were no ejection seats aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. As Bruce pointed out, in the early space shuttles, they had put ejection seats. That's when they had far fewer crew members. But two things quickly became apparent. First of all, those who rode the early shuttles apparently came back and said, listen, you're kidding yourself if you think anyone could survive with an ejection seat if anything goes wrong. And that's point number one. Point number two, as the number of people put aboard the space shuttles grew, it was determined we're only kidding ourselves by putting these ejection seats in, and there were no ejection seats aboard the shuttle this morning. Now, there's been no announcement on the fate of the crew after the explosion this morning, but it appeared there was no way they could survive. You look at the videotape and you say to yourself, how could anyone survive that? No American astronaut ever has been killed in flight. 3 were killed on the launch pad in 1967. The current NASA administrator, William R. Graham, was meeting with congressmen on Capitol Hill about the NASA budget when they saw the disaster on television. Steve Goldstein, who's an aide to Representative Manuel Lujan, who's a Republican of New Mexico, Steve Goldstein said, and I quote, NASA officials told the congressman it doesn't look like any lives were saved, unquote. The other crew members aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, that is, besides schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, were the commander, Francis R. Scobie, 46, the pilot, Michael J. Smith, aged 40, 36-year-old Judith Resnick, Ronald E. McNair, 35 years old, Ellison S. Onizuka, 39, and Gregory B. Jarvis, 41. Schoolteacher McAuliffe, well, they now have the names under the photographs. And let's pause for a second and ponder the faces of the 7 people who were aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. The $1.2 billion spacecraft, one of 4 in NASA's shuttle fleet, was destroyed, completely obliterated. Parts of the ship fell into the Atlantic about 18 miles southeast of the launch pad. On a slow-motion video rerun of the explosion, as we've shown you, it was difficult to determine the exact source of the explosion. Bruce Hall passed along the theories put forward by veteran observers there. One theory was that the explosion began in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters attached to the side of the main fuel tank. Another of the theories put forward was that the explosion had happened, began very near where the solid rocket booster is attached to the main liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fuel tank. Liquid hydrogen, keep in mind, is highly explosive. And there was one theory, after looking closely at the slow-motion videotape replay, that the early part of the explosion actually happened in the main fuel tank near where a seam is there. It was difficult to determine, to say the least, the exact source of the explosion, but unmistakably, when the huge fuel tank with nearly 500,000, 500,000 gallons of volatile propellant ruptured, it did tear the Challenger into many, many pieces. NASA said the fine pieces of debris continued to fall into the impact area for nearly 45 minutes. It took 45 minutes before all of the debris, or large portions of it, came down in extremely small pieces. Recovery boats and aircraft were dispatched to the area. They had to wait until the debris stopped raining before they could get into that ocean area to make a search. Paramedics leaped into the water in an effort. They parachuted down in an effort to find any trace of survivors. There is no word of any survivors. After the explosion, the two solid fuel rocket booster rockets did separate out and continued to fly crazily out of control in the clear sky. They were both trailing long trails of smoke before they plummeted into the water. One of those solid rocket boosters was seen floating down on its parachute. Recall, that's the way that if a launch goes well, both of the solid rocket boosters are supposed to fall away, fall down in the ocean by parachute, and be recovered and used again. The big tank, the main fuel tank, the one with the liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, those are not reusable. On previous launches, once the launch goes off well, that big tank drops away and somewhere over the Indian Ocean and is not recovered. Television pictures of the impact area relayed from a helicopter showed no evidence of any large pieces of debris floating in the water. Those are those shots from the helicopter that we've been showing you throughout our coverage. The launch had been delayed repeatedly, most recently because of fears that icicles on the launch pad could harm the shuttle. And as Bruce Hall reported from Cape Canaveral earlier, the launch was delayed about 2 hours this morning while they made an icicle check. That was because of the 28-degree temperature, very unusual for Florida this time of year, that prevailed overnight in Florida. Leslie Stahl, one of our White House correspondents, has been working at the White House this morning along with Bill Plant, our other veteran White House correspondent. Leslie, is there any late word about the president and what he knows?
Yes, Dan. First, let me tell you that there is an assumption here at the White House that nobody could have survived that explosion and that there are no survivors from what happened today. The president did come in and talk to a group of reporters who were having a briefing on the State of the Union, which the president says he will still go ahead and deliver tonight. He talked about the tragedy. He saw it on television. He saw a replay of it only moments after the explosion. He said he was more than saddened. It was a tremendous shock. He says he cannot get the teacher, Krista McCulloch, off his mind, although he did talk about the other brave people and their sacrifice. He talked about the families and how his heart goes out to all of them. He said this would definitely cast a pall over his State of the Union address tonight that was supposed to be very upbeat. He was going to be looking toward the future and, in fact, had written in a passage about Krista McCulloch and the future, the space shuttle program, the new frontier. He was asked by the reporters in the room what he would like to have people telling children who might have been especially interested in this flight because a teacher was aboard. And he said that he would like them to talk about Krista McCulloch and the others as pioneers who had sacrificed their life on the great frontier, and that just because of one tragedy, we cannot stop going forward. He was asked, what if a backlash develops over the space program because of this? And he said that he would be a voice opposing doing anything to stop the program because it is our new frontier and the only frontier we have. I can tell you, Dan, that there is real grief at the White House, as you can well imagine, as I'm sure there is all across the country, but a special grief because Krista McCulloch was here at the White House when she was named to be the teacher to go on this flight. I happened to have been in the room. She did not know till she got here that she'd been the chosen one, and the president made the announcement himself. He was the one who wanted to put citizens aboard. He was asked, well, do you think this should stop the idea of having citizens? And he said, well, everybody who goes up in
TV show starring a bunch of
rockets, spaceships are citizens, and that the whole point of the program is to have citizens, and he does not want to see that stopped.
Thank you very much, Leslie Stahl. At the White House, the schoolteacher, Krista McAuliffe, was one of 2 women aboard the flight today. The other was astronaut Judy Resnick, who was, in fact, the second woman in space, the second woman behind Sally Ride. And we want to show you something about Judy Resnick in a moment. But just before doing that, we want to pause and underscore the following. We want to stress, as we've tried to do throughout the coverage, that we don't know, nobody knows, nobody has said, nobody can know at this early hour exactly what caused the explosion aboard the Challenger. And NASA has yet to say anything about it. That's something to keep in mind. Now, another thing to keep in mind, we've tried to explain to you as best we can how the launch went this morning, what the situation was as we looked very carefully at that slow-motion videotape. And we've mentioned several times that it appears in the videotape that the explosion, the very first explosion, may have occurred in or around one of the solid rocket boosters. Again, if we can get the model over, we don't want to by any means overwork it, but to try to understand, these are the solid rocket boosters. This is the main fuel tank. Shuttle rides on top of it. Now, on the videotape in the slow motion, it appears that the first explosion you can see on that slow motion videotape is at around the right-hand side of one of these solid rocket boosters. But you may want to keep in mind that on these solid rocket boosters, the booster fuel, which we've been talking about, is a rubber-like substance. That's the fuel that makes these rockets go. Now, it's the rubber-like substance which forms the fuel for these solid rocket boosters. You couldn't make that explode on its own if you hit it with a sledgehammer repeatedly. So that may be something you want to keep in mind. If this is a rubber-like substance in here which wouldn't explode on its own, it has to have some source of ignition. Now, you can speculate the rest of the day on what some source of ignition for exploding this solid rocket fuel might have been. And then there was also the idea that the liquid fuel in the main fuel tank, Bruce Hall spoke earlier about liquid fuel in the main fuel tank, which is the liquid hydrogen at least. It's liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. The liquid hydrogen at least is highly explosive, and some observers looking closely at the slow motion of the videotape believe that the explosion may have in fact began somewhere in this area on one of the seams of the large tank. Now, Bruce Hall, if you're at Cape Canaveral and still reading us, this is what we've been trying to pass along, the information that the fuel in the solid rocket boosters is that rubber-like substance, and it couldn't ignite on its own, while the fuel in the big tank certainly could ignite on its own.
Dan, you're correct on that the fuel aboard that main fuel tank is highly volatile. It is liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen. It is so volatile that it has been one of the crucial parts in the development of the shuttle program. In the Russians, in their attempt to develop a similar shuttle program, one of the reasons many scientists say that they have fallen far behind the U.S. in the development of a shuttle program is that they were never able to master that liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen problem because of the high possibility of an explosion. One thing that we should understand, as you have mentioned several times, Dan, the main tank does fall off over the Indian Ocean. Now, the way that it falls off is that it is secured to the shuttle by several bolts, and those bolts it comes off by a small, almost like an explosion. It's a small explosive device, and at the time when the main fuel tank is supposed to separate from the shuttle, those bolts, the pyrotechnics, they would say, explode, and that sends the main fuel tank away and down from the shuttle. One of the things that several people are looking at here at the Kennedy Space Center, and I emphasize they're looking at all kinds of things, but one of the things they're looking at to see if there could have been a possible premature explosion or explosive device on the main fuel tank, and one of those bolts prematurely exploded, and therefore setting off the explosion, the big, massive explosion which we saw with the main fuel tank. Going back in history, Dan, one of the things back in the very early part of the space program, in the Mercury capsule with Gus Grissom, when he went into the water, one of those bolts exploded after he hit the water, and it made it very difficult to rescue Gus Grissom. There was an inquiry afterward looking into that. There was no conclusive evidence coming out, but apparently one of those boats, according to many people in the space program, exploded at the time of impact there. So that is just one of several things that they're looking at closely here at the Kennedy Space Center and at Johnson Space Center in Houston. But it is a possibility, and they're looking very closely at that explosion with the main fuel tank in mind. Along the seams, at the point where the fuel tank is directly attached to the shuttle Challenger.
Bruce,
we said,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but one thing occurs to me, and we want to underscore it, if so. One of the reasons given for the last delay, that is the delay before this morning's icicle delay of this Space Challenger, was said to be some difficulty with bolts, was it not?
Yes, we had several problems with bolts yesterday, but that was a bolt in the hatch, the door of the shuttle, and that should not be connected with this whatsoever, the hatch being away from where the point of difficulty occurred today. There also was this morning a delay of approximately 1 hour in the launch with what they called a faulty gauge, and there was some report that that could be involved in a bolt, but even if it was a bolt, it's more likely in the gauge area and would not have been directly related, according to all the evidence that we have now, directly related to the explosion itself.
Bruce, I think at this point we should take another look at the launch this morning and exactly what happened. And if I may ask you to keep your microphone open and come along with me with the description, I'm particularly interested in your observation that at the very moment of liftoff this morning, that it appeared to you and to some other observers that perhaps the shuttle was getting off a little bit slower than it usually does.
4, 3,
I have seen more than 20 launches of the space shuttle so far, and it appeared that this one almost hesitated on the pad, sort of the way the old Apollo program did. And then it went up, and several people around me said, that's a different manner than we've seen it go before, and it appeared to be a little bit slower. It turned over as it normally does with the shuttle on the bottom side. And at this point, everything appeared to be okay, but we were still looking at each other and saying, what about that liftoff? It was a little slower to our observation anyway.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
And at this point, NASA has said on a preliminary report everything was normal.
65% shortly.
And the problem comes in just a few seconds there when NASA gives the order to throttle up.
3 good fuel cells.
Also, we need to look closely to see if there's some fog near the end of the tank just before the explosion,
altitude 4.3
which would indicate
range distance 3 nautical miles.
A problem a little earlier than the actual explosion.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
This is at full throttle.
Roger, go throttle up.
Now there's just before the explosion, Dan, there appeared to be almost a fog or some of the smoke
downrange distance 7 nautical
up beside the shuttle itself, actually beside the main engine tank, the fuel tank, and that is unusual. You normally do not have anything like that occur. The first thing that most people would look at that is for some type of a leak, a possible fuel leak, a possible hole someplace.
Well, Bruce, we want to take a look now at the slow motion videotape. This was the smoke and debris coming down. This is the slow motion. And let's describe what's happening here. This is just before the explosion.
Right there, Dan, just before the explosion. You see on the top of your screen, it appears that the flames to the left of your circle, you also see some flames, and that is just before the explosion. And that is something that indicates to some people at NASA that there may have been some type of a fuel leak. Now, that still indicates that the explosion itself occurred with either the main fuel tank or from something created by the solid rocket boosters, as we have been saying. Bruce? And that fireball there is the main fuel tank.
Bruce, no one can forget how explosive that liquid hydrogen fuel is in the big tank. That the shuttles own 3 main engines, the one tucked right in the tail of the shuttle itself, operate off that liquid oxygen and the liquid hydrogen. And you mentioned the possibility, there are all kinds of possibilities, but certainly any leak, anything untoward having to do with that liquid hydrogen could spell trouble in a hurry, particularly during the critical stages of launch, as was the case this morning.
That is true, that the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen are extremely volatile, and that is something that the space program had mastered, and we indicated that the Soviet Union had reason their program had fallen so far behind because they had not been able to.
Well, Bruce, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. One of the reasons that they want to look closely at that tape, and the NASA officials are huddled looking at this tape, they want to see what those flames are that occurred just prior to the explosion itself, and see why there were some appeared to be flames out of where the normal flame would be from a normal shuttle launch.
Bruce, Norman Mailer, the author, wrote about the United States mission to the moon. My recollection is he called it fire to the moon, as in riding fire to the moon. And it was so easy to forget when things were going all that well with NASA and all the space shuttle flights that those astronauts, whether they're many or few, what they are doing, in fact, is riding fire.
They were riding fire. When you leave that launch pad, it is a ball of fire, and you are riding on that fire as you go into orbit. It is an extremely dangerous situation. The astronauts knew that. They trained for this. And a lot of people said, some of these people do not appear to be very emotional about this very dangerous ride that they're going to be taking. But they were trained that they had so much work to do in that first 2 minutes that they were to concentrate entirely on that job of theirs during that first 2 minutes, and they were extremely busy. And the lack of emotion that some people have seen, it was actually false, because afterwards when you come down and you would talk to these astronauts and get them aside, they would say, it was a very emotional moment. But I had a job to do, and I was performing that job, and that's the only reason it did not appear to be very emotional to the others who were watching at the time. But it is a ride on a ball of fire into orbit.
And in author Tom Wolfe's phrase, it takes the right stuff to do it. Worth mentioning, I think, Bruce, and you and I have not had a chance to talk about this, but in the years of covering the American space program, one of the things that has always stood out is the dedication of the people at NASA. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has been rightly and justifiably over the years, however you feel about the space program itself, a center of excellence and dedication to excellence. Nobody, it should be pointed out, can feel worse today about what has happened to this Space Shuttle Challenger than those many dedicated people, everyone from the secretaries up through the engineers, as to what has happened today. That one wants to keep in mind that there have been 56 manned U.S. space missions, 56, and never before today has anyone been even badly hurt, much less killed, during flight. There was the accident on the launch pad during the Apollo program in 1967, unless we forget those names. Virgil Gus Grissom, who was the commander of that flight, Edward White, Roger Chaffee, were killed January 27th, 1967. 19 years ago yesterday, ironically. Today, of course, being January 28th. On January 27th, 1967, 3 American astronauts lost their lives, but it was on the launch pad during the Apollo program. And Bruce Hall, you mentioned something before that caught my ear and may have with our viewers and listeners, that one theory about why the Soviets have lagged behind in manned space travel. One wants to point out that the Soviets have, in unmanned space travel, accomplished some marvelous and miraculous things, and they have done some, had some tremendous accomplishments in manned spaceflight. But in general, they've lagged behind in manned spaceflight, and the theory that one reason is they've never mastered having their spaceships ride the mixture of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, as the United States space program has depended on. That they're very good and have been very good ever since World War II in rocketry. They, like the United States, took advantage of some of the German knowledge during World War II of advanced rocketry, and the Soviets, when they moved across Europe, got their share, some would say more than their share, of Soviet scientists and engineers. Their version versions of Warner von Braun and others to help them develop the rocketry. While the Soviets have been good with rocketry, that they've never quite mastered this idea of liquid fuel. And one reason, of course, is that it is so tremendously dangerous. But that leads to the thought, we don't know much about how many accidents the Soviets have had, do we?
No, we don't know how many accidents the Soviets have had, but we have been given a lot of information indicating there have been a number of accidents, and the Soviets have had extreme difficulty and several accidents, according to authoritative reports, when they were dealing with experiments with the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. It has been something that has been extremely difficult to master, and it has been a problem also in several other of the shots, not the shuttle shots, but in the earlier part of the program, the NASA program. That has also presented a problem, and it is something, as we have said, and you have repeated, Dan, it is extremely volatile. And once you're dealing with substances like that are so volatile, that you have to be extremely careful, and you have to have it just exactly right. The astronauts, many times before they would launch and after they would launch, they would call the whole launch procedure a 7 million pound of controlled explosion. And that's really what it is once they leave that launch pad. It is a controlled explosion that propels them into orbit.
Excuse me, Bruce, it must go right is right. I'm sorry to interrupt, Bruce. I know our audience understands this is live television and we don't have the best of communications between the two of us. Stay with me, if you will, Bruce, because there's a bulletin on the Associated Press just in from Washington. The Associated Press says, and I quote, President Reagan's State of the Union speech scheduled tonight has been canceled. House Republican leader Robert Michael's office is said to have just announced this. Yes, I understand this is contrary to information that we had from the White House and our White House correspondents just a short while ago. We have no independent confirmation of this. The last official word we had was that President Reagan would indeed, on the advice of Donald Regan, his White House chief of staff, go ahead with the State of the Union speech tonight. But the Associated Press now reports on a bulletin basis, speech canceled. President Reagan's State of the Union speech scheduled tonight has been canceled, according to the House Republican leader Robert Michael's office. We'll be in the process immediately of checking and double-checking that, and we'll keep you posted as we go along. Our last report was that the President intended to go ahead with the State of the Union address tonight as previously scheduled at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We see scenes from the White House briefing room on one of our monitors here, and it may be that Larry Speaks, the President's spokesman, will be out fairly shortly to give us the official word on whether the President's speech is or is not remaining on the schedule for tonight. At our last official word, it was on the schedule, but the AP says it has now been canceled. We had said some time ago that we were going to discuss the fact that Judith Resnick, the second woman in space, was aboard this space shuttle this morning. We're going to hold on for a moment and not do that. And if you see me looking off to the side, I want to explain to you why. I do have a monitor in which the White House briefing room is up, and our thought was that perhaps Larry Speaks would be appearing shortly to tell us whether the President's speech had been canceled or not. So if you see me looking off to one side, that's the reason that is being done. The NASA officials continue to be silent about what happened this morning and why it happened. There's not been any official announcement that all 7 persons aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger perished. It seems inconceivable after seeing the videotape that anyone could have survived, but NASA is in the uncomfortable position of not being able to definitely determine whether anyone survived the flight, and understandably, they have made no announcement as of yet. We were saying earlier about the dedication of the National Aeronautics Space Administration people, everyone from the janitor up through the secretaries, to the engineers, to the scientists, to the administrators, to the backers of the NASA program in Congress, how dedicated they've been to excellence and to safety. And the fact that they've got 56 manned U.S. space missions. This is the first time there's been any serious accident in flight. There was that 1967 fatality, 3 astronauts killed on the launch pad, but nothing in flight before this. And there have been 24 space shuttle missions, 56 manned space shots by the United States, 24 space shuttle missions, all of them in safety. A remarkable achievement, and all of them under close public scrutiny, all of them open to coverage all the way through. Only this morning, for the first time in flight, a disaster. NASA said that the explosion occurred about 1 minute and 12 seconds into the mission at a point where the astronauts were beginning to throttle their engines up to maximum thrust. Now, this was after the astronauts throttled their engines down to a 60% level at the 35-second mark. at the picture, you have this tremendous liftoff, and at the 35-second mark, they throttle back to a 60% level. That's in order to reduce the forces of gravity during the liftoff. For those of you who remember your high school or college physics, that in order to reduce the forces of gravity during liftoff itself, you have this tremendous thrust from below. They throttle back to about the 60% level in order to help themselves get off. But at just before the explosion, you heard the voice saying, "Roger, throttle up." They were just at the moment of maximum thrust is when NASA apparently believes that the explosion occurred. Now, among those who witnessed the explosion were schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe's class and the children in the school in Concord, New Hampshire. They were watching the liftoff. Mrs. McAuliffe's attorney husband, Steve, and her two children, 9-year-old Scott and 6-year-old Caroline, they were in a crowd at Cape Canaveral. The members of the school where Mrs. McAuliffe taught were watching in Concord, New Hampshire. Members of her family, including her two children, 9 and 6, and her husband and her mother and father, were all watching at the Cape. Also, they were members of the class in Concord, New Hampshire, had Go Krista banners. Here's Larry Speaks at the White House.
1L. The President, in consultation with the leadership of Congress, has decided to postpone the State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the space shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then the President said to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation?
No, the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the space shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is the other remarks?
The President will, will for the balance of the week continue on his
previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry, to follow that up, Larry, can you tell us, does the President have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, they're, you know, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression of the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American,